All right, our scripture today is found in the book of Ruth. We're looking at Ruth chapter 1, verses 8 through 17. And we're looking at Ruth because of the book of Matthew includes Ruth in the genealogy of Christ. So I want to read you, before we jump over to Ruth, I want to read you what Matthew says again. A record of genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahashon, Nahashon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Okay, we're going to stop there and jump over to Ruth. But so we've been talking about the women who are found in the genealogy. There are 5 if you include Mary, and she is part of the genealogy of Christ, so I don't know why you wouldn't include her, but I have to figure out where Ruth is. It's one of those funny things, you know, it's right there all the time, and you generally have your bookmark in there so that when you're at the pulpit you can't find your place. I know where Ruth is. It's right after Judges. But sometimes those of us who do this all the time have to go through the song, right? Joshua, Judges, Ruth, them first. All right? So we're in Ruth. We're going to be looking at Ruth chapter 1. And I want to give you an overview of the story of Ruth before we look at the specific passages we're looking at, because we're going to be looking at 1 verses 8 through 17. But in the story of Ruth starts out with Naomi and her husband, and he is named there, but it's a hard name to pronounce, and it's a hard name to memorize too. They go off to Moab because there is a famine in Israel. All right? And one of the funny things about this is Moab is not a place they should be going. That's interesting. The tree went out. Okay. Moab's one of those places. They were the enemies of Israel. The Israelites, they're not supposed to be intermingling with the Moabites. But Naomi and her husband and their 2 sons go off to Moab because, well, there's nothing for them in Israel. Right? They want food. Who doesn't go where there's food, right? So they go off, and while they're there, they find daughters for their 2 sons. Ruth is one of these 2 daughters, and they're living together, kind of a thing. They're living in Moab, and Naomi's husband dies, and then Ruth's husband dies, and her sister-in-law's husband dies. So all of the men in the family, they die. And if you remember from last week, we were talking about how when your husband died, if they didn't give you any children, you were supposed to marry the brother-in-law, your brother-in-law, and he would produce children for your husband. Well, Ruth doesn't have that option. Okay? And so Ruth and Naomi and Ruth's sister-in-law, I believe it is Oprah, not Oprah, I always do that. It's like that. It's Orpah, not Oprah. Right? That's the dyslexic in me. But Orpah and Ruth and Naomi, they realize that the famine has gotten to Moab now. And they decide, maybe we should go back to Israel. And in this decision, Naomi is going to tell the girls they can go off on their own. We'll read that. But so eventually Ruth and Naomi, they go back to Israel. And things aren't very great for them because you can't own property in Israel if you're a woman, and so they need people to take care of them. And so Naomi finds a relative of theirs named Boaz, who is a wealthy man, and she coaches Ruth on how to win Boaz's heart. And Boaz kind of falls in love with Ruth, but there is a kinsman who is closer to them that Boaz actually needs to go and buy Ruth from, because he would be the next one in line to take care of what the brother-in-law should have done, sort of a thing. And so Ruth and Boaz get together after Boaz essentially buys Ruth. He redeems her. And that's the story of Ruth, okay? They get married, they have children, and in that line comes Christ. So let's look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 8 through 7. This is right after everybody dies. Very depressing. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead, and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this time they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. At this they wept again. Then, I read that already. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." And that's what I wanted us to read to today. And so we see that Ruth makes a decision to follow her mother-in-law. You know, we make decisions to follow. We made a decision, most of us have made a decision to follow Christ, right? When we make that decision, there is a cost to be made. A cost to be paid, right? Ruth, as she is listening to Naomi, Naomi says, "Look, I have nothing to give you." Essentially, Naomi is telling Ruth, "Ruth, I'm going home to die." And Ruth says, "You know what? I'm going to go with you." She recognizes the cost. "I know that you have no more sons. I know that I'm going to go with you because the cost is worth it. The cost is worth it." And I have in your bulletins Luke 14. It's a rather lengthy part of Luke 14. But Jesus says, when you come to follow me, you need to count the cost. You need to think about what it's going to cost to be my disciples. So Jesus says, "Look, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciples." Now, we don't like the idea of hating people, and so we explain that away by saying, look, this is a comparison type thing of you love something so much that anything else appears to be hate, right? He's saying, look, you need to be willing to leave your family behind for me. That's what he's saying. And you know, we don't think about this so much, but when we get married, it's kind of what we do. We say, I'm going to leave this family that I had before to be a part of you. A lot of times our families, they go, no, that's not what happens. What happens is you're marrying into the family. Well, it's not the case, really. The case is that you're leaving the family behind. You know, Sarah likes to go, well, you'd rather be with your mother. No, I left my mother to be with you, right? Right? We leave and Sarah, our first year of marriage, we went down to Tennessee. She left her family behind. She did it. She was all in. Of course, we did come back to her family, and her family is grateful that we don't just say, nope, stay out of this. So he says, if you're not willing to hate them, if you're not willing to lead them, you can't be my disciples. He goes on, and whoever does not bear his cross and come after me, he cannot be my disciples. You know, we have crosses all over the place. We have a cross here, we have a cross there. I'm sure we have crosses all over the tree. You know, lots of people wear crosses. For us, crosses are, and yeah, they're in the stained glass windows too, I think. There's one over there. We've got crosses all around. For us, we don't think as much of the cross as that instrument of death as we do of the instrument of our salvation. We don't have that association that they had. That he's not saying something light here when he says, unless you're willing to take up your cross. He's saying, unless you're willing to die. And not a pleasant death either. A very painful and excruciating death. A death of torture. Unless you're willing to do that for me, you cannot be my disciples. And then he illustrates that with this. He says, for which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Lest after he has laid the foundations and is not able to finish it, also who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going to make war against another king does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciples. This is the third time he says, cannot be my disciples. We have to be willing to give it all. To put it all on the line for him. I was thinking last night, because when we're done with this, I got to figure out where we're going in the sermon stuff. And I was thinking last night about a book that I got for Christmas maybe 5 years ago. I actually got it from Trudy. It was a book called Radical. She said, pick out a book and I'll buy you a book for Christmas. And I said, that's the one I like. And she said, why do you want that? You're already living a radical life for Christ. I said, because I want to see how to do it better. And the reality is because I also want to be able to help other people be radical, right? Because what he's asking here, what Christ is asking, is for us to be radical. For us to be willing to do everything we can for his sake, for his cause. That we would count the cost and say, hey, it's worth it. It's worth it to put all on the line to follow Christ. And the reality is, I think that the church in America is suffering today because we don't. Because we want to have all of our goodies and Christ. And Christ is just another addition to our life, not the sum of it, not the total of it. Well, Ruth says, you know what? I'm willing to give up everything to follow. I'm willing to die, she says to Naomi, in her decision to follow. So the first thing I want you to see is that there's a cost, right? The second thing I want you to see is that there's a choice. There's always a choice. God always gives us a choice. And it's one of those things where that choice is constantly given to us. I am a believer that once you come to know Christ, you're saved and you're always saved. And part of that is because I believe once we come to know Christ, that choice becomes so much easier. Right? That choice becomes, you know what? I know him well enough to know that any other way would be wrong. When he, after he had fed the 5,000 with the bread and the fish, the day after he goes across the sea and he gives a sermon about I am the bread of life. And unless you eat my flesh You cannot be right? It was another one of those, you cannot be a part of the kingdom unless you do this. And everybody, when they hear him talking about eating his flesh, this idea of cannibalization, they kind of go, whoa, this is crazy. Now, we recognize that this is actually something we do in the communion, and it was symbolic to some extent, but it's really taking in who he is and being a part of who he is and being conformed to his image. But when everybody leaves, he looks at the disciples and he says, will you leave too? And the disciples look back to him and say, where else shall we go? Where else will we find the words of life? Right? Once we know him, the decision, I think, becomes easier. The choice becomes easier. But we have that choice, whether we follow him or if we go back. In the book of Ruth, Orpah, not Oprah, but Orpah turned back. And one of the things that hits me is verse 15 where it says, look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. You see, we have that decision. Is God really our God, or is something else our God? Is something else going to take precedence over that? A lot of us, we look at what's happening in our nation today, and we kind of get fraught, and God says, don't look at that. He says, look, you're not a part of this nation anymore. You're a part of a new nation. You made a decision. Keep making the decision to be a citizen of heaven. That's where our kingdom is. That's where our citizenship belongs. And it turns out that, you know what? It doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you fall on here in America. You are a citizen of Christ, and that's the way you should behave. Right? That's the ideology you should be expressing as Christ, because it turns out that his is different than both parties. But we have to make that choice. We have to make that choice. And when we choose not to, we are going back to our old gods. We are going back to our old ways. We are going back to something that is not as good. You know, I think of it as, I shouldn't say that, that's divisive. I was thinking, it's like having a cherry Coke and then going back to a cherry Pepsi, but some people think the cherry Pepsi is better. So if you think the cherry Pepsi is better, it's like having a cherry Pepsi and going back to the cherry Coke. Weird people. My cousin's one of those. But I know, I'm weird too. But it's like having the top notch. It's like having Wagyu beef. And then going back to just a plain ordinary steak. I've never had Wagyu beef, but it's supposed to melt in your mouth. But I can't see paying $1,000 for a steak. I mean, or $100 even. That's ridiculous. But once you've had the real thing, it's hard to go back. But yet, so oftentimes we do. Here's the one. It's like having one of my wife's hamburgers and then going back to McDonald's and ordering a hamburger. Yeah, McDonald's, it was cheap, it was easy, but it was cheap and easy. And it tastes cheap and easy. It's not the real thing. Right? But yet, we do it. People do it all the time. I've had good macaroni and cheese. This killed me. Our kids asked for the Kraft macaroni and cheese after having Mom's macaroni and cheese, after having Jen Jen's macaroni and cheese, which is, to me is the best macaroni and cheese I've ever had. Right? And they want to go back to the blue box. And you know, sometimes I'll eat the blue box stuff. And then I go, why did I eat this? It's a waste of calories. It doesn't even taste good. Why? But we're given those choices all the time. To follow God or not follow God. And yeah, there's always a cost when it comes to following God. Turns out there's a cost to not following God too, but we don't always pay attention to it. You know? This Christmas, we were at my parents' for a week, and there was a choice I had every day: eat the cookie or don't eat the cookie. I chose to eat the cookie. There was no cost to eating a cookie, right? Well, my pants and my shirt felt a little tighter by the end of the week. My belly got a lot bigger again. Right? We don't always notice the cost right away, but we have to think about the cost when we think about the choice. And when we think about the cost, we think about the choice, we make the choice, we come to realize that something happens when we make that choice. And I think when Ruth made her choice, it wasn't just about Naomi. I think it was about her God too. That Ruth's decision wasn't just, hey Naomi, I think you're great, and so I'm going to die with you. I just love you so much. It was, hey Naomi, you have something real in your God. Your God is something true. But when we come to know God, something else happens. Ruth says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. When we choose to follow God, not only we've come to the cost, we've made the choice, now something happens is we have connections. We have connections. We are now connected to God. I am His, He is mine. That was one of His promises, right? If you will obey me, I will be your God and you will be my people. A connection is made that wasn't there before. You know, I think of when children get adopted. They get adopted into a family, and a connection is made between them and the adopted parent that didn't exist before. There becomes a bond, and in the biblical times, when you adopted a child, you couldn't take them back. I think that's a wonderful idea. You can't take them back. You've got to love them. Because you know what? There are some times when my children are acting in certain ways that I like to put them back. I'm not sure my wife would appreciate that so much, but you can't give them back. A connection has been made when our children were born and came into this world. A connection has been made between us and God when we make that choice. But one of the things that I find in this passage of Ruth is the connection isn't just between Ruth and God. Or it's not just between Ruth and Naomi. But it's between Ruth and the people of God. You see, when we come to know God, we get a new family. We have another connection that's made. And we have all these people around us, and it is fitting that Trudy was grateful for the congregation. That was her joy today, right? Because when we come to know God, we get connected with each other. One of my professors is a pastor over in Syracuse, and he said his church's vision is to love God and to love people, right? And I've had this argument with people many times, especially at our first church with our, I don't even remember what the position was called, our lay leader. He argued that the greatest commandment was to love your neighbor as yourself and all that stuff. And I said, that's the second greatest commandment. The greatest is to love God. And he said, yeah, but they're the same thing. I said, no, they're not. They're actually different. I said, I can love my neighbor and hate my God. He looked at me as though that was a puzzling thought. I said, my neighbor is not my God. I can love my neighbor and hate God, but I cannot love God and hate my neighbor. And God actually says that, I think it's in John. He says, you cannot love God and hate your brother for your brother that you see and the God you don't see, right? I can see my neighbor, but I can't always see God. I know He's there. I feel He's there. I trust He's there. I've read and I see the things that He does, but it's kind of like, it's like the janitors at Disney World. You know they're there because the park is always clean, but you never see them cleaning, right? That you'd have to go to Disney World. I want to go to Disney World, right? Sorry. You can't love God and hate people. And so when we come to know God, when we come to love Him, when we come to choose Him, a connection is made between God and His people. The book of Hebrews says, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness. We have each other to build each other up, to help each other out. It turns out when Ruth follows Naomi, she is connected to Naomi's family, to Naomi's people, and she gets taken care of by Boaz, and they are redeemed. They are saved. Their life becomes full because of a connection to the people, first established through God. And so there is a cost to be paid. There's a choice to be made, and then there's a connection that is made. And in that connection, we find that it was worth it. It is always worth it to follow God. It is always worth it to do the right thing, even if at the time it doesn't seem that way. You know what? It would have been worth it to say to my mother, I love these cookies. Please don't give them to me right now. There's a cost to be paid, a choice to be made, connections to be made. And so it's our job to go through that every day, to think about that. God, am I living my fullest to you? God, am I as connected to you as I should be, as I could be? God, am I doing what you want me to do? Am I willing to lay it all down? And then we have to make that choice. It always comes down to that choice. And that choice always goes out. It always becomes an action. You know, I chose to eat the cookie. It went to my mouth. There were some days I chose not to eat the cookie until after lunch. Right? That's the way it worked. We have to make those choices, and those choices become actions. We have to live it out. Will you bow with me in prayer? Oh, Heavenly Father, we just love you and we thank you for everything, all that you do. And we thank you that we can look back through your lineage and see such people like Ruth, who was an enemy, a Moabite. But she chose to follow you after counting the cost, realizing that it was her life that she was putting on the line. She was willing to die to follow you. And because she followed you, Lord, she made such wonderful connections. She had a family greater than any other. She was in the line of Christ. Lord, help us to follow you, to pay the cost, to be willing to give up everything for you, to be that radical Christian. We love you, Jesus. Amen.